Okay, why don't we get started? Sue, sit down, please. Hi. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm Gary Heinrichs. I'm Wisconsin DNR Floodplain Planning Program Manager out of Madison. And I'll be presenting the workshop today. With me, we have a number of county staff here. Kay Miller in the purple sweater and back. Sue Vanden Langenberg in the, not pink, I don't know, what color do you call that, Sue? Pinkish? Chartreuse, is that a color? No. Sitting up here front, Rick. Next to her from the county, another, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. John from the county also, and Mariah, the planning director for Door County, and back here. Could we go around the room and just find out where folks are from, what organization they represent, or what profession? If we could start in the far back, sir, in the white.
John Bowden, land surveyor.
Thank you.
Joe Schradel, land surveyor.
Jan Campbell, real estate agent.
I'm Bob Cuffern, I'm the interim village administrator for Sister Bay.
Mario Leachek, representing the city of Sturgeon Bay.
Sharon Peterson, representing land surveyor of Sturgeon Bay.
Kathy Standen, I'm a realtor.
Connie Aronson, Door County Realty.
Jamie Sanger, Coldwell Banker, the real estate group.
Annie Sadler, realtor, Coldwell Banker, Door County, the real estate group.
Amanda Kohler, Bay Lake Bank.
April Aquino, Bay Lake Bank.
Laura Sutherland, realtor.
Jan McKelvey, ERA Star Realty.
Andrew Hutzek from Bank of Luxembourg.
Kim Gudex, Thomas Pfeiffer Insurance in Sister Bay.
Pam Wiegand from Thomas Pfeiffer Insurance.
William Menego, ERA Star in Sturgeon Bay.
Chris Olson, the County Sanitarian Department.
Great. Okay. Thank you all. Hi, Glenn. That's Glenn Sellner, Kewaunee County Zoning Administrator. If you could sign in, Glenn. Do I have to? Yes, you do. Everybody signs in. I even made Sue and Kay sign in. There are seats up front if you'd like, or you can sit back there. Well, thank you all for coming out today. I know Sue and Kay did a lot of work trying to get the word out about these. It's a really good turnout, nice mix of folks, insurance agents. There were a couple insurance agents. Great, that's great. Lenders, realtors, community officials, that's what we're looking for, and surveyors. Talk about a couple things today. The big topic is changes of the flood insurance program, but also we'll talk a little bit about letters of map revision and map amendment. I do these workshops every year. I work under a contract with FEMA, even though I'm a DNR employee. My salary is paid by FEMA. This is work that they can't get out around to the states to do. They don't have the staff. So we act on their behalf, essentially as an agent with FEMA. I'm also the National Flood Insurance Program liaison for the state of Wisconsin. So if you have flood insurance questions, you can contact me directly. If I can't answer them, I can put you in touch with FEMA's flood insurance experts. We have 2 folks in Chicago that can help out. There's going to be a lot of confusion about these changes. There already is a lot of confusion. This is known as Biggert Waters 12, or BW12 for short. Some of the effects have been felt already this year. Other things are coming this fall. So a little background on how we came to this position and what's going on, what's changing going forward. NFIP has been around since 1968. Actually, coincidentally, not by any grand design, the National Flood Insurance Program came into being roughly the same time period that Wisconsin authorized both floodplain and shoreline zoning through the Water Resources Act of 1966. Both were in part a response to the great floods in the Midwest in 1965. The Mississippi River, Ohio River, many of the other tributaries. Was a very, very devastating flood. Tens of thousands of folks were affected, houses destroyed, people displaced, businesses closed. And at that time, there was virtually no private flood insurance left in the market. Companies had just exited the market. It was just too difficult to properly price flood insurance. The potential pools of insureds, right? EDS? Thank you. Was just so small. It's a self-selective pool. Only people who had flood frequently were buying flood insurance. So the premiums got rather high. Federal government, U.S. representatives saw a need for some sort of federal program that would help folks out, provide some subsidies in exchange for communities adopting sensible land use controls to prevent future development in the floodplain, or if people were going to build in a floodplain, to ensure that they build to higher standards, use better flood-proofing materials in constructing homes, and stay out of dangerous high-hazard coastal areas and floodway areas. Well, the idea at that time was any new construction going forward after maps were produced for a given community, those people would pay actuarial rates because they would be elevated, at least to the base flood elevation, the numbers you see on the map. That's the federal minimum standard. In Wisconsin, we have a higher standard. We call it freeboard. In the state of Wisconsin, all new structures or substantially improved structures, those that have been damaged beyond 50% or are undergoing improvements or additions that equal or exceed 50% of the structure's equalized assessed value. We require they be elevated lowest floor 2 feet above the base flood elevation. The idea back in 1968 was that class of structures that were going to get a subsidy, local community zoning staff would call those non-conforming structures. In the NFIP lingo, it's a pre-firm structure, pre-flood insurance rate map. In other words, those structures were built before the first flood insurance rate map was issued for any particular community. Now, some communities would have gotten a flood hazard boundary map, which is a very crude map, and later they would have gotten a firm map where there was better engineering data or topographic data available. Pre-firm means before the first firm map. So in some cases, folks, their houses were built after the first flood hazard boundary map, before the first firm map. They're still considered pre-firm, and they do enjoy a subsidy. About 19 to 20% of all flood insurance policies nationwide are currently subsidized. The problem is that number has not changed a great deal over the years. It's gone down somewhat, but it's still much, much higher than anyone expected it to be from the perspective of 1968. The thought was back then, and the community zoning officials here can probably appreciate this with me, is that non-conforming structures would eventually be brought into compliance either because of the property owner's wish to build a new structure or because they wanted to do additions or improvements that would kick them beyond the 50% and they would have to elevate. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. And as we've seen over the last 4 decades, the proportion of flood insurance premium or flood insurance payouts because of losses has gone up and up as far as the percentage that is attributed to these pre-firm structures. And it really was demonstrated in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina and 2 other named hurricanes that year, where the NFIP went about $18 billion into debt, and it was further amplified last fall through Superstorm Sandy. It was not a hurricane. It was downgraded before it hit land just because of the intensity of the rainfall and duration. Even though it wasn't a hurricane with hurricane force winds, it still caused tremendous damage. Resulted in about another $10 billion in losses to the flood insurance fund. So now we're about $28 billion in debt, and it may go higher because they have not closed out all the claims made at Superstorm Sandy. So 2012, Congress realized the program is unsustainable as it was currently, so there needed to be some changes. The upshot is that those pre-firm structures with getting subsidized rates will be losing those rates over the next few years. There are several different scenarios we'll talk about. What properties are most affected, when they can expect to see rate increases, how much those increases might be. I'm not going to give any specific examples today. All I can tell you is that the average current flood insurance policy in Wisconsin is about $700. Now that takes into account a lot of folks that have what we call preferred risk policies, where they have a flood insurance policy even though they're not in the mapped floodplain. We haven't mapped all floodplains. There's thousands of miles of floodplain throughout the country, maybe even here in Wisconsin, have never been mapped and may never be mapped. There just isn't the budget for it, and the watershed might be so small that typically FEMA, if the watershed area is less than 1 square mile, they don't map it. But there's lots of folks that buy policies anyways because they're in low-lying areas, they're on small, flashy streams or tributaries that even if they're not mapped, flooding does occur there. Nationwide every year, 25 to 30%, sometimes more, of all flood insurance claims are for properties outside the special flood hazard area, also known as the 1% chance flood, or more popularly known as the 100-year flood. A term we don't like to use because 2007, 2008 in south central and southwestern Wisconsin, we had back-to-back 100-year floods, and 97, 98 in the southeast Wisconsin, the Milwaukee metro area, we also had back-to-back 100-year floods. So you kind of lose your credibility when that happens. People say, well, there's nothing to this 100-year, it doesn't make any sense. So we go by 1%, which is that in any given year, a flood approaching the magnitude of a 100-year event has a 1% chance of occurring, and that's the more accurate depiction. But again, that can vary from year to year. So you can see some of the triggers for these increases. What's happening this year, 2013? We've already started phasing out the subsidies for certain classes of properties. Broad picture in Wisconsin, we have about 16,000 flood insurance policies. It's gone up a little bit in recent years, not a lot. Maybe 10 years ago it was 15,100, 15,200. But we have seen an increase as we've modernized the maps for the state of Wisconsin, and we've modernized a little over 60 of the 72 counties. People are being required to buy more flood insurance or flood insurance for the first time for several reasons. One is that the bank might now realize that they actually are in a floodplain even though the flood risk has not changed, or they have been newly mapped into the floodplain and they are now required to buy flood insurance. So we have seen a slight bump, nothing like some of the Gulf Coast states or the East Coast states where they've seen huge increases. Another reason is that the lenders are getting more cognizant of the requirements of the flood insurance program, that if they don't fulfill those requirements, to make sure that all mortgages that meet certain standards have flood insurance on them, they can be hit with pretty heavy fines from the national government. So what we're seeing in 2013, as of January 1st of this year, not next year, January 1st, 2013, all subsidies were phased out for non-primary properties. The federal government defines this as a property that's lived in less than 80% of the year. This is very germane up here in Door County. I mean, I have no idea what the number is, but it's probably well over 50% of your properties are not primary properties. So anyone who had a subsidized policy has lost that subsidy. How much the increase will be, it's hard to say, but that is an immediate change. They're being phased out right now. It's not going to be a one-shot increase to the non-subsidized rate, but it's going to be phased in. In other words, let's say that they're currently paying $400 a year for flood insurance, and it's a non-primary residence, and the non-subsidized rate, let's say, is $1,200. So the difference is $800 more. Eventually they'll have to pay. Well, they're not going to sock it to them that much immediately in this first year, but what they'll do is they'll divide that by 4, and so they'll tack on $200 in 2013, another $200 in 2014, 15 and 16 until you get to the $1,200 actuarial rate. So that started January 1st of this year. October 1st, just a couple months away, they're going to see subsidies eliminated for business properties. There's about 1,000 structures in the state of Wisconsin affected that are business properties that have a subsidized rate. They'll go through that same 4-year phase-in process, and the other would be relatively minor. It's structures that have been severely or repetitively damaged. We only have 10 of those statewide. But non-primary, there's about 1,300 statewide. I'm guessing hundreds and hundreds of those are probably here in Door County. So it doesn't necessarily take effect on January 1st of this year. It's whenever their policy is up for renewal. Most flood insurance policies are 1-year renewals, so whenever their renewal comes up, they will start seeing increases. Of course, if somebody's buying a policy for the first time now, any policies purchased after July 6, 2012, will see immediate actuarial rates, or if someone lets their policy lapse, they will see immediate actuarial rates. If someone's in a pre-firmed house with a subsidized policy, as long as they keep the policy in force, it's a single-family structure, and they don't sell the house, they'll keep their subsidized rate. But eventually, it's going to go up when they sell the house or when they get new maps. So this is, as I want to make this clear, it's a little misleading. 20% of NFIP policies nationwide are currently subsidized. But in Wisconsin, it's much higher. For Region 5, it's 50%, almost 50%. Because why? Because we have an older housing stock. You know, we're not Las Vegas or Miami, Florida, the East Coast, the Gulf Coast. You know, we have a lot of older homes. State of New York did a study. They say they have about 80% pre-firm structures. So instead of 50% increases, we're going to see, instead of 20% of our housing stock or our flood insurance policy base, it's going to be closer to 50%. We did the numbers. Out of the 16,000 policies, about 7,600 will be affected. The 1,300 for non-primary residences, about 900 for business residences, 5,000 primary residences throughout the state that are currently getting subsidies. Single family, and there's about 400 or 500 multifamily structures. So it's about almost 7,700 flood insurance policies in Wisconsin will eventually be affected. So it's going to be a huge increase in this state. So again, just to reiterate, it's 25% a year, but it's not 25% over the current policy cost. So if you're paying $400 now, it's not just that you're going to pay $100 extra. If the difference is $800, it's going to be 25% of that $800 difference every year. If you guys have any questions any time during the presentation, feel free to jump in. Yes, sir.
Are these subsidized rates? Are they like grandfathered rates, or you talk about these subsidies all the time? Where do they come from?
The subsidized rates, good question. When the pre-firm structures were built, there was no floodplain maps, no floodplain program. No one knew what the flood elevation was. No one knew what elevation these structures were built to. So it would be unfair, the reasoning was back in 1968, to require these people to pay flood insurance based on elevation. Basically, flood insurance, has two key components. One, like any other insurance policy, the value of the policy, how much coverage is being offered. But the second component, the key one, is it's based on the elevation difference between the flood elevation on the map and the lowest floor elevation. So the higher that lowest floor is, in other words, the greater that difference is, the less you pay for flood insurance. So they didn't factor that second component in when pricing it. There was just a constant factor used. The value of the policy, they would look at whether there was a basement or not, how many stories the house was, type of, 2-story, 1-story, split level. They'd look at highest adjacent grade in some cases, whether it was in a coastal community, but they would not look at the elevation difference. Now they're going to. Basically, from now on, when people have to buy a policy, even for pre-firm structures, they're going to have to get an elevation certificate. So in most cases, they'll have to hire a surveyor. I call this Flood Insurance Reform Act the Full Employment for Surveyors Act of 2012, because every one of the flood insurance policy, not everyone, most of the people with actuarial policies already have an elevation certificate or something similar. But for that 20%, or in Wisconsin, closer to 50%, when they want to renew their policy or get a policy for the first time, they will need a FEMA elevation certificate. How many people have filled out one or have seen a FEMA elevation certificate form? Okay, well, over half the crowd. Good. So that'll be the standard that everyone's going to need, because the flood insurance costs will be based on that lowest floor. So basically, unfortunately, it's going to hurt a lot of folks, older folks, people on fixed incomes in older homes. You can imagine some small communities, virtually the entire housing stock might be pre-firm structures, whether in or out of the floodplain. There may not have been any new development for the last 20, 30 years. So anyone in that map floodplain who had a subsidized policy will now have to get an elevation certificate if they have a basement. Now, it's not so much the basement, because the only thing we insure, ladies from the insurance company, what do we insure in the basement of a structure for flood insurance? Furnace? What? Mechanicals, right. And the walls. If the walls collapse, we'll cover that. But as far as finished basements, we don't cover anything. Carpet, panelized walls, furnishings down there, beds, couches, pool tables, none of that's covered. So it's really that lowest habitable floor, not the basement floor. So if that's well below the BFE, they're going to see a big bump in their flood insurance rates. Now, if they do have a basement, like most people do in Wisconsin, yeah, if you have a basement floor below BFE, that's going to affect it somewhat, but the big issue will be that lowest first floor, the first habitable floor. So it could be significant for some folks, especially those folks, older communities along the river where they're building right in the floodplain, in the floodway maybe. Do people know the difference between the floodway and the flood fringe?
No.
Sue and Kay do, but maybe no one else. Basically, There's a couple different ways we map floodplain in Wisconsin. In some rural areas, and many of the rural areas in Door County, we have what we call Zone A floodplains, where there's no flood elevation shown on the map, and there's no differentiation between the different flood zones. The floodway is the channel of the river itself, and what we call the overbank area. Basically, that area of the stream channel and the overbank area that's needed to carry a major flood event downstream without any impedance. So it's what we call an effective flow area. Water is moving through this area during a flood event. Landward of the floodway is the flood fringe. That's the only buildable area in the floodplain under state regulations. That's more of a storage area. Water collects there, and as flood levels drop again, that water drains back into the channel. So in the flood fringe you can build as long as you're 2 feet above and you have dryland access. Floodway, where there is moving water, no new construction is allowed, nor are substantial improvements allowed. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, no improvements, additions, structural repairs, modifications, worth more than 50% of the equalized assessed value of the structure. And that's a cumulative figure too. It's in 1 year, let's say 2005, someone put on a 400 square foot addition that represented 20% of the assessed value of the house. Well, that's 20% of their 50% allowance. In 2013, they want to put on another addition or a second story, and that would represent 40%, let's say, of the current assessed value. It's always based on current assessments. Well, they couldn't do it because they've already used 20% of their allowance. They only have 30% left. Once they hit that 50%, the entire structure has to be brought into compliance. Now that you can do in the flood fringe. You can elevate the structure, provide dryland access, but in the floodway, you can't go beyond that 50% because there would not be an allowable use in the floodway. So those are the folks that could be hit pretty severely by this, with the lowest floor fairly low in the floodway. Their insurance rates could get jacked up quite a bit, and let's be frank, it could affect the saleability and the value of the home for resale. But that's the reality. It was passed by Congress. Unless Congress changes things, this is the implementation schedule over the next 4 years. Any other questions at this point?
But the floodway is only associated with rivers, not the bay or the lake.
Right, yes, just for riverine, yeah. But as we said, we have, probably not so much in Door County, you don't have a lot of riverine areas, but there are Zone A areas where we don't have a base flood elevation. If that's the case, before anyone can build in those areas, if it's a Zone A, they have to get a study done by a registered professional engineer to not only establish the base flood elevation, but delineate the floodway flood fringe boundary line, because of course we need to know, since you can't build in a floodway. So that does also add to the expense of building in a floodplain in Wisconsin. Just to repeat, owners of primary residences, as long as they keep their policy in force and don't sell their home, they can keep that policy. But that policy is not transferable to the new owner. When they sell that house, the new owner will be hit with the full actuarial, we call it the full risk rate of the policy. So if they were the old owner, the current owner is paying $400, well, the buyer will be paying $1,200 for that policy. Yes?
If a property is foreclosed and the bank takes the property back, or the mortgage company takes the property back, is the lending institution then forced to buy insurance?
It's a good question, Glenn. Let me think about that a minute. I don't think so, no, because it's only if there's a mortgage on the property. Now, when the lender takes it back, that cancels out the mortgage, essentially. So no, there's no flood insurance purchase requirement for the lender.
What protects the property if there's a flood?
I'm sorry?
What protects the property if there's a flood?
The lender has to decide. I mean, typically they may have some sort of protection, but I don't know that. I'm not sure how. We have a couple lenders here. I don't know if the folks from the bank would have an. That I don't know the answer to, but no, they wouldn't be required to get flood insurance. They may want to continue some sort of policy. They may be self-insured, or they may have some kind of group policy for all their mortgages. In this kind of case, I don't know though.
What if it's transferred between family members?
It's a new owner. Yeah, it's still a new owner. As far as I know, they would still have to pay the higher rate, because If there's a transfer, a new deed, if the ownership is transferring, the legal ownership is transferring, then they would have to get a new policy and pay the higher rate. As far as I know, yeah.
I know we weren't gonna specifically talk rates, but
Yeah.
for a couple of our inland lakes where we have local datum,
Yeah.
instead of using a BFE-based flood elevation, are those rates typically higher? Because, I mean, the DNR recognizes our local datum, but FEMA doesn't, I mean, are those?
In many cases, the pre-firm subsidized rates can be higher for structures that are built in compliance with the local zoning code, because if they're built 2 feet above, using the subsidized rate is not really a subsidy at all in most cases. You're better off just getting it rated based on the elevation of the lowest floor. So the only property class that the subsidized rates protects are those where the lowest floor, the first lowest habitable floor, is below the base flood elevation. Those are the people getting a subsidy. So yeah, it doesn't always pay to go with the zone A or the pre-firm rate. In some cases, if your first floor is high enough, you should probably have it rated, get an elevation certificate and have it properly rated.
But will it make it, okay, like, let's say these are new structures, but like Clark Lake and Kangaroo Lake,
Yeah.
based on local datum, would their flood policies be higher because there's not an actual base flood elevation?
Probably, yeah. So just to recap, non-primary residents, 25% increase of the difference every year until they reach full risk rate, which is 4 years. Not previously insured, newly purchased, or repurchase a policy after lapse, full risk rates will apply immediately. And also 25% premium increase for pre-firm business properties. As I said, there's about 900 of those in the state. And for severe repetitive loss properties. We only have about 10 of those. So that's not a huge part of the mix here in Wisconsin. Just a little timeline. There are going to be increases for everyone this year. We typically, not necessarily every year, but many years we get an annual, just an increase like you do for any insurance policy, whether it's auto, home, life, or flood insurance. And that average will be a little over 5% this year. Another change, though, is, as you see in the lower right-hand corner, that 5% reserve fund. That is another facet of Biggert Waters 2012. Because we have this $28 billion hole, they have started a reserve fund fee to prevent any further debt to accumulate in the program. Now, it's going to take a while for this to build up, but everyone with a flood insurance policy will be paying, in addition to their regular premium, let's say it's $1,000 a year, they'll be paying another $50 into this reserve fund. On the right there, in the orange or red, that's another thing I want to talk about, grandfathered rates. Basically, well, we don't know yet. I think I got another slide on this later. We don't know exactly when next year, but the idea is that when a community gets new maps, Door County at this point, no new maps, Kewaunee, no new maps, although you have the Great Lakes mapping, and that'll probably go effective in a couple years, so there will be new maps. It won't be county-wide. But for folks along the coastal areas where most of your policies would be, when those new maps go effective, even if it's a primary residence and they receive a new map, they will start being phased out of the subsidized rates. And that will be on a different schedule. I can't tell you why. Instead of 25% for 4 years, it'll be 20% of the difference between the subsidized and non-subsidized or full risk rate. So it'll take 5 years to bring those policies into compliance with Biggert Waters 12. So Kewaunee is scheduled to get, Brown are all scheduled to get new coastal mapping. In 2015, I believe they're going to go effective, is what I understand. I think the preliminaries will be out about a year from September or October. So you can expect that for along the coastal areas of Lake Michigan and Green Bay. There will be some increases there also. So what does it mean for floodplain administrators? Well, thank goodness we do have the higher standards in Wisconsin, because that 2 foot of freeboard makes a world of difference for flood insurance costs. You compare a standard policy, and you compare between a home where the lowest floor is at the base flood elevation and one where it's 2 feet above. The folks that are more protected with a 2 foot of freeboard are paying probably about half the premium that the folks at the BFE are paying. So one of the things we'll really be stressing in these workshops, and also when we do open houses for new maps in the coming years along the Great Lakes, is mitigation programs. The best way both to protect properties and to keep the flood insurance costs down are to elevate structures whenever possible, if they're not already elevated. We do have some state mitigation grant dollars for that, the Municipal Flood Control Grant Program. Through the 2013-2015 budget, which was just passed last month, we can expect about $3.5 million in 70% state cost share monies to elevate structures, to bring them in compliance with current floodplain standards, lowest floor 2 feet above. That's the best way to bring down flood insurance costs. Another option, of course, is to talk to your insurance agent. If you're in a minimal risk area, you're in a special flood hazard area, but you have minimal risk in your area, you might want to consider raising your deductible to contain costs, and also just to visit with your agent and talk about how much coverage you have. The minimum everyone has to have is the value of the loan. Some insurance companies, not insurance companies, some lenders are now requiring, I've heard this more on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, they're requiring replacement value of flood insurance coverage. That's their right, they can do that. There's some class action lawsuits about that very issue now, but typically in most mortgage documents, there are provisions that allow the lender to require whatever level of insurance, whether it's homeowners, flood, whatever, that they wish to protect their investment in the property. So they can do that. If that happens to one of your residents or one of your clients, they can certainly, consider refinancing, looking for a lender that only requires the value of the loan for flood insurance rather than the replacement value of the structure. Again, I can answer most flood insurance questions. When it comes to specific rating questions, I may not always have the answer. I can put you in touch with people who are much smarter than I am about flood insurance. You can also go to the floodsmart.gov website. Like any other insurance, each property is rated individually. There are common factors, especially in the floodplain among properties, but everyone's going to be at a slightly different elevation, have a slightly different value, and have different needs as far as total amount of coverage, deductibles, whether they want contents or not, do they have a basement. So there's some good information out there on floodsmart.gov and also on FEMA.gov about BW12. A lot of the same stuff I have here, but there is more detail in some cases. As I said, elevation certificates are going to become very critical. Everyone that currently is a pre-firm policy, at some point or another, it could be this year, it could be 20 years down the road, we'll probably need to get an EC. Beyond elevating structures or removing structures from a floodplain, we can look at other things. It is possible for legal nonconforming structures to elevate by means other than the use of fill. Even though we can't build a new structure in Wisconsin on walls or pilings, you can elevate an existing structure. The benefit to elevation is that the way the state administrative code is currently written, as long as you elevate the lowest floor to 2 feet above to that freeboard at flood protection elevation, the cost to elevate don't count against your 50% allowance for making improvements or additions to a non-conforming structure. So you can elevate, and that doesn't count against your 50% allowance. You can put it on continuous wall foundation as long as you use that lower area just for storage of materials or parking of cars, and you have flood vents. That can also reduce your flood insurance costs and further protect your structure. So we can answer questions about the mitigation program, and we can put you in touch with people at FEMA who have experience with elevating pre-firm structures and putting in breakaway, putting in vents and things like that into the foundation as a way of lowering flood insurance costs. This is just an example from the federal government. Different premium rates based on different elevations of a structure. As you can see, far left, the structure has the lowest floor 4 feet below BFE. In the middle, that's the basic federal minimum, at or above BFE. And on the right, that's a little bit higher than the state requirement. That's 3 feet above. The single best thing a community could do to further protect their residents is to go from 2 feet above to 3 feet above. Doesn't add a lot to the building costs, but it will bring down flood insurance costs even more. It's not as big a drop as it is from 0 to 2 feet above, but it's still probably in a range of 10 to 20% savings a year on a flood insurance policy to go to 3 feet above. Every one of the flood insurance policy is also eligible for something called increased cost of compliance. And I think I'm going to talk about that here. Guess I got ahead of myself a little bit. Just a couple things to point out. If a community grants a variance to a property owner to not meet minimum floodplain development standards, it's a legal structure with a variance, but they don't get a discount on their flood insurance. They still pay. If they get a variance to put their lowest floor at the base flood elevation, well, they pay that higher rate, which could be twice as much or more than if they'd elevated to the flood protection elevation. So the variances really don't matter. I mean, at BW12 really doesn't have any effect on that. They always would be paying actuarial rates because even if they had a variance. Historic structures, obviously by definition, are pre-firm structures because of when they were built. They could have gotten subsidized rates in the past. They are exempt from the substantial improvement clauses, but they are not exempt from the higher actuarial rates that will be going into effect this year for those structures. There we go. Maybe that's a historic structure that's been elevated, or it's in the process of being elevated. I know aesthetically some people don't like this, but in the floodplain, the facts are that's the single best way to protect the structures is to get it up. Concrete piers, wooden pilings, or a continuous wall foundation. That's the best way to protect it. If you've ever been to the East Coast or the Gulf Coast, you'll see lots of these structures 8, 10, 12 feet up in the air. I don't like the looks of it either, but it's just a way of life down there. Some people put elevators in. Yeah. FEMA even has a technical bulletin on installing an elevator in an elevated structure. That's what you're going to be seeing out in New Jersey, Long Island, places like that. That's the only way they can rebuild in some of those communities is to elevate. Now, it might not be as bad as the Gulf Coast of Mississippi or Louisiana, but it still could be 4, 6, 8 feet above ground elevations. So a few things. I talked a little bit about retrofitting structures. Folks with basements, which is most properties in Wisconsin, one of the cheapest, simplest things to do is just elevate your water heater, your furnace, other mechanical equipment. You can get some reductions in flood insurance costs by doing that, depending on the elevation of the basement floor. Sometimes simple landscaping around the structure can prevent flooding. Of course, our highest priority for the Municipal Flood Control Grant Program is to acquire structures and either move them out of the floodplain or demolish them and pay fair market value so someone can relocate and start again. I know that's probably not going to be a real popular option up here. You have a lot of high-value properties on the bay and on Lake Michigan. I don't think we've ever had an acquisition up here. We may never have an acquisition up here. But in many parts of the state, south central, southwestern Wisconsin, we've done hundreds of acquisitions over the years. This is what I was getting at, ICC. Every one of the flood insurance policies, so a little over 16,000 property owners in Wisconsin, are paying $75 a year in addition to their flood insurance premium for ICC coverage. Basically, this pays for elevating beyond the base flood elevation. In the past, FEMA only paid for that through the NFIP because that was the federal standard. Well, lots of communities besides Wisconsin communities have higher standards. And people were out of luck. Their flood insurance policy would not pay for elevating from 0 to 2 feet above. ICC was instigated to cover that. So up to $30,000 can be used to properly elevate a structure. So in addition to this regular claims payment, folks can get up to $30,000 more if a structure has been substantially damaged. That's the key. And to bring it into compliance with the local ordinance. So those two conditions must be met. This is down on the beautiful Mississippi River. My colleague, my counterpart in Illinois, sent some of these pictures to me. We see this in parts of Wisconsin on the Mississippi. You go over by Prairie du Chien, north of there, there's a couple little communities where they have structures on concrete piers, wooden pylons, or sometimes basement walls like this. As I said, for a pre-firm legal non-conforming structure, this is acceptable. I administer the municipal state program for flood grants. For the federal programs, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, that's handled by Roxanne Gray and her staff out of the Wisconsin Emergency Management offices, also in Madison. And ICC grant monies can be used, or flood insurance monies can be used to pay for local cost share. As I said, for municipal flood control, the local share is 30%. And this is a nice example of a mitigated community. Buildings cleared out, stream bank restored, recreational trail put in. Ottawa, Illinois, an entire neighborhood bought out. We haven't done a lot of this in Wisconsin. Prairie du Chien, down by Villa Louis, if you've ever been down there, that's the old 4th Ward of Prairie du Chien, also called St. Ferial Island. Corps of Engineers back in the 80s, through a different program, which is kind of defunct now, they don't have funding for it. They bought out almost the entire neighborhood using federal grant monies to do so. Yes, ma'am.
Is that acquisition?
That's acquisition, yep. Yep. Just buy the houses and tear them down and fill in the basements and turn in the green space. That's what we mean by acquisition. Now, in some instances, they will move homes if it's feasible, but in most cases, they just pay the property owner fair market value, pre-flood fair market value. The federal government will hire an appraiser to do an appraisal. If the property owner disagrees with the appraisal amount, they can hire their own appraiser. And then if there's a big difference between two appraisals, the feds will hire a mediator, basically, someone to look at both appraisals and come up with a fair figure, a compromise. It's a voluntary program. Money cannot be used for eminent domain, so it has to be a willing seller, willing buyer. But yeah, that's what we mean by acquisition, just clearing out a neighborhood. Now, in some cases, unfortunately, because it is voluntary, we may get half of the residents in an area, or 2/3, or maybe 1/3. And the rest choose to stay, and that's their right. But as these pre-firm subsidies are eliminated, they're going to find it's quite expensive to stay in some of these older neighborhoods, because the flood insurance costs are going to go up tremendously.
Is the previous slide connected to these two slides, or are they two different?
I think those are two different communities. Yeah. So, a few resources. As I said, floodsmart.gov has an excellent set of materials on Biggert Waters 12. You can also go to FEMA's webpage. You can either go to their web pages or you can just Google this stuff too. I find it easier just to put in Biggert Waters or BW12 in the Google search engine, and it'll bring up the FEMA website, the FloodSmart website. If you want to look at the floodplain maps for any particular area, you can just go to the Map Service Center, msc.fema.gov. And if you have questions about FEMA maps or letters of map change, you can call that 877 number, 1877 FEMA map, and talk to a letter of map change or mapping expert. Any questions about flood insurance before we move on to Lomax? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question that maybe everyone else knows except me, but when you use the word pre-firm, is that an acronym, firm?
Flood insurance rate map.
Oh, rate map.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking pre-firm about, you've got, we have a lot of homes that were authorized by floodplain permits, and now we've got new maps.
Mm-hmm.
And elevations have gone up and they've become non-conforming structures.
But if they were built after you received your first firm map, they're still considered post-firm. It's when you receive your first firm map. If they were built before
Do
then.
they get any type of subsidies if they complied at one time and no longer comply?
No, because they were built post-firm, so that means they had to be built to a certain elevation. So they never had a subsidy to begin with.
Okay, there was never.
And now because the flood elevations went up, they are going to start paying higher, well, they should have been paying higher flood insurance because it's based on the difference between first floor and the base flood elevation. So if they were 2 feet above, flood elevations went up a foot, now they're only 1 foot above, they will be paying a higher rate. Glenn?
I think I heard you say earlier that you said there were 16,000 policyholders in the state of Wisconsin.
Yes, roughly.
Can you break that down even more to see how many policyholders are in Kewaunee County or in Door County?
I can't do that here. I don't have the information with me, but I mean, yeah, sure. You can also go to, you can Google this too. You can Google FEMA Community Status Book. And it'll bring up the FEMA webpage, FEMA Community Status Book. And it'll bring up a list of all the states. You know, it's just a drill down menu. Click on Wisconsin, click on your county. And within each county, you can look at the county total, which includes cities and villages. You can also look at each community within that county. And it'll give you all the flood insurance policies, both the A-zone policies and also the non-A-zone, the ones outside the 100-year floodplain. Yep, so you can find it there. Was there, over here, and then you, ma'am?
Couple of questions.
Yeah.
Who establishes the BFEs on these properties?
Well, it varies. I mean, ultimately, it's the federal government.
Up and up and up,
Hmm?
you know?
Up and
Seems
up
like
and
it
up.
keeps moving.
Ultimately, it's the federal government. In Wisconsin, we manage many of the floodplain mapping projects we've done over the last 10 years. As I said earlier, we've remapped approximately 60 to 62 of the 72 counties. And we were the primary contractor on roughly half of those. The other half were done by a private engineering firm out of Chicago. In Door County, I think it was CDM that did your first round, and they also, I think they did Brown County too. But it was a mix then of different, either their engineers or our engineers did the studies, the actual engineering modeling, to determine what the base flood elevation is. Basically what we do is we apply a 100-year rainfall event to the watershed, and then they look at a model to determine, based on land cover, soil types, slope, how much of that, let's say it's 7 inches of rain in 24 hours. That's a common figure for a 100-year rainfall event. They then calculate how much of that 7 inches actually reaches the river itself. Some permeates in the ground, some is absorbed, and some reaches the river channel. Then they do what they call a hydraulic analysis. They look at the shape of the channel. Is it a V-shaped channel, a U-shaped channel, how wide, how many bends in the river, obstructions like dams, are there wetlands? And they calculate from that, so basically how efficiently water moves through that channel, how fast it flows downstream. So,
Lakes.
well, the lakes is different.
You know.
Yeah, that's a different animal. The BFE on a lake has not changed.
2009 when we had.
Yes, yeah. But before that, I think, when did you get your first maps in this county?
78.
Yeah, so between 78 and 2009, it was always the same, I assume. Because to study the Great Lakes is a tremendous undertaking. And as we are studying the Great Lakes now. They developed a whole new model. We had those technical meetings last year about this time, I think August, September. We held 5 meetings along Lake Michigan. We're basically remapping all 13 counties along Lake Michigan. So in that case, you're looking at wave runup and wind, they call fetch, the wind coming across the lake. So that's much, much more complicated. So we did revise the flood elevations in 2009, I think based on an old Army Corps of Engineers model. Now they've completely thrown that out and started from scratch. They spent about 2 years developing this new model, which from what the engineers tell me is based on 250 historical storms. So they've synthesized these 250 storms, made some assumptions about how water flows and the beach conditions and offshore obstructions, and now they're applying that to a 100-year storm event. And they're going to come up with new elevations along Lake Michigan. What those are going to be, no one can predict at this point. So they did go up in 2009? Yeah, okay, I do remember. How much about? How much?
A
couple inches? Yeah. It's possible it'll go up some more. It may drop. I don't know at this point. I don't know how much that helps, but but the best I can tell you right now.
Brings me to the second part of my question is,
Yeah.
you know, how many, I don't think there's, I don't know, I don't know of any flood insurance claims in, say, the last 20 years that happened above the BFE in Door County. I don't know, have there ever been, we're nowhere near the flood elevation.
I don't have that information with me. Yeah, I mean, that's something I can research if, for Kate and Sue, if you're interested. I mean, there is historical data available from FEMA. We can look at it. You're right, we get very few flood insurance claims in Door County. Now, south of here in Green Bay, we get tons of flood insurance claims. We have over 800 policies in the city of Green Bay alone. We have another 400 in Brown County. Door County, I think we have, yeah, and with the cities and villages, it's maybe another 30 or 40. It's less than 100, so there's very few. This is one of the least flood-prone areas in the entire state. That's very true. And that's reflected both in the number of flood insurance policies and the lack of flood disasters up here.
I think what probably Joe is kind of starting to get to, when we deal with future or prospective buyers of a property, and we tell them it's in the floodplain, and when they build, they're gonna need a floodplain permit, they're gonna have to elevate it, and I'm sure the lenders and the insurers are dealing with it also. It's hard to explain to people because they only associate it with low water levels, and you try and explain that the majority of flooding, and we don't have a lot in Door County, but the majority of flooding in Wisconsin is based on rain and storm events, not on how high the lake is.
Right.
We had a lot of lots that were built on, filled in wetlands, so the surrounding wetlands only have so much storage capacity. So if something happens to the back, those little streams get inundated, their property could very well flood, but it's not gonna be from, you know, potentially a high water level on the lake. So I'm sure the lenders and the insurers get frustrated too. Well, you're gonna make me buy flood insurance because, you know, I have to have a mortgage, but the water levels are lower than, so it's a tough thing for all the regulators, the lenders, and the insurers to be able to explain.
Unfortunately, we can't change the floodplain maps based on cyclical lake levels. It's just not something FEMA has authority to do or the resources to do, because then we'd have to do it for inland lakes too, I suppose, and it's not feasible. Yeah.
That flooding doesn't occur just because of a lake level.
Right, I agree. Flood insurance covers any overland flooding. It's not just riverine or high lake levels. Anytime, let's say you have a freak storm event where you have a nor'easter and you have 80-mile-an-hour winds and you have 10-foot waves coming in, that will be covered even for properties outside the floodplain. If they have overland flooding in their structure because of this freak storm event, they will be covered under, if they have a flood insurance policy, because as long as the water's coming over the surface of the ground into the structure, flood insurance covers it. Flood insurance does not cover sewer backups, and it does not cover groundwater flooding. You just have high water tables in your area, and water comes up through your basement floor. Flood insurance does not cover that. Homeowners insurance does not cover that. But anytime water's coming over the surface of the ground, and at least 1 acre of land or 2 or more adjacent properties are affected, flood insurance will cover the damages to that property. Yes, Sue?
With regard to flood insurance along the Bay or Lake Michigan, we've primarily been talking about flood insurance for the home itself, but given when we did have high water, the high water was during storm events, taking out land, retaining walls, riprap, things like that. Does the flood insurance cover or protect replacement of those types of structures, the retaining walls?
No. 2 walls and a roof. It's got to be a building, basically. They will not cover something like that. No. Was there another question in the second row that I got it answered? You got it answered? Yes, sir.
With regard to the timeline you showed, you had a 5% reserve fund fee.
Yes.
What is that? What is its purpose? What's it being used for? And does the homeowner get it back when they sell the property?
No, they do not get it back. It's a reserve fund. Literally, it's an insurance fund for the insurance fund, basically. It's money that should not go toward claims payouts in a given. It wasn't me. The flood insurance premium everyone pays every year is supposed to cover any expected losses during that year. The extra 5% is for these extraordinary loss years like Katrina in 2005, Sandy last year. So no, it's not something that a property owner will get back. The idea is we have this $28 billion in debt. The 5% hopefully will help to start paying that down because Congress has been unwilling to write that off. They've had a few of these events in previous years, like 93 flooding, 78 I think. There have been a few years where the flood insurance fund ran out of money and they had to borrow money from the US Treasury, and eventually Congress, after a lot of finger pointing and back and forth, they basically forgave the loan. Well, this, in 2005, they were unwilling to do it. In 2012, they're unwilling to do it. So the only way to get that $28 billion off the books is to start accumulating a little extra money every year, hope we don't have any other huge loss years coming up, and start putting some of that money toward that $28 billion red that we have. So yeah.
To my next thing, are we paying them for these extreme events on the East Coast?
Yes, everyone in the entire country is paying for those. Unfortunately, like a lot of other federal programs, Wisconsin, because we are progressive, forward-thinking, and we have higher standards, and we've done a better job protecting residents and property, we're paying for the mistakes or the lack of foresight that places on the Gulf Coast or the East Coast. Yeah, so basically they're in a big hole now, and we're all digging them out. It's, you know, we're one of the states, I mean, to digress a little bit, you know, we're one of those net donators to the federal government. You know, we're one of the top ones as far as the ratio of money we send to the feds to the ratio we get back. It's like, it's about 70 cents on a dollar. And you got places like Mississippi and Alabama get back maybe $1.50, $1.60 on a dollar. So it's just the fact of life. It's unfortunate, but, and there's been a lot of talk. I mean, there's a U.S. rep from Michigan who's trying to eliminate, she wants to start their own self-insurance fund in Michigan and get out of the NFIP. Well, it's not as easy as it sounds. We actually had a couple communities in Wisconsin try to do the same thing, but they found out they weren't going to save any money over the long term. But yeah, it does seem to a lot of people, and I question it sometimes myself, it seems like our rates should be lower based on our risk in some communities than what we are paying. But according to the feds, according to their actuaries, everyone's paying what they're supposed to be paying. Frankly, I find it hard to believe sometimes myself, but that's just the reality. Yeah, I would say the total premiums that Wisconsin residents and businesses have paid in since 1978, that's how far the records go back, it's at least 50% higher than what we've gotten back in claim dollars. So we have paid a lot more than we've gotten back. That's statewide aggregate, you know. By communities, it's hard to say. Some place like Prairie du Chien may have come out ahead, or Green Bay might have come out ahead, or La Crosse. Door County is probably one of the net contributors. I'm sure you've paid in much more than you've gotten back. So we're moving on to the second phase of our program, Letters of Map Change. This is a distillation of what I did last year. Some of you may have been at my workshop. I don't know if Sue and Kate probably heard some of the stuff from last year. Glenn might have heard it, but for a lot of you folks, some of this might be new. And there's a few important things we'll talk about. LOMAC is the umbrella term we use, Letters of Map Change. And that includes LOMAs, LOMARs, and LOMARs based on fill. 90% plus of all LOMACs are LOMAs. LOMAs are for very specific cases where a house, pre-existing house, or a lot is on natural grade. And I'll cover this a couple times because this is a key point. That means that no fill has ever been placed on that lot, or if fill was placed, either it was placed before the first FIR map, so pre-1978, or when the fill was placed on a lot, the property was not in a map floodplain. Subsequently, it was mapped in. That is still considered natural grade. Any fill placed after 1978, or after a property has been mapped in a floodplain for the first time, a LOMA cannot be issued on that property. It would fall under the LOMAR F, letter of map revision based on fill. So MT1s versus MT2s. For LOMAs and LOMAR Fs, you typically use the MT1 or sometimes what we call the MTEZ, which I'll talk about. For LOMARs, which is usually a new study or a physical change in a water course, you use the MT2 form. So just to reiterate, it is All three categories are an official revision to the existing flood insurance rate map, but the only one that results in an actual new map is the LOMAR, and it's an annotated panel. Let's say a new study is done for a 1 mile reach of the Anapi, that's the name of a river, right? The Anapi River. There's so few rivers here, it's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. Anapi River. A new study is done and comes up with a new base flood elevation. The old BFE in this area was 683, and the new BFE, based on this new study, which is reviewed and approved both by the Department of Natural Resources, Miles Winkler out of our Green Bay office, and by FEMA's engineer reviewers in Maryland, approved this study. They issued a LOMAR. The BFE changes for this 1 mile reach. An annotated firm panel is issued for this 1 mile reach, which is then adopted by the community through the regular Class 2 public notice, public hearing adoption process. That becomes the effective base flood elevation, and if the floodway boundaries change, becomes the effective floodway for that stretch of the Anapi, right? Anapi River. So everything else, a LOMAR based on fill, is a revision to the map, but it's not a new map. It's just a letter saying that we've changed the map for different reasons. The LOMA show that this house is actually above the floodplain elevation, even though the map shows it in. A LOMAR-F acknowledges that, yes, it was in a floodplain, but you filled 2 feet above with dryland access. You're now out of the floodplain, but the map still shows that lot in the floodplain. Risk map, by the way, I'm not going to say a lot about it. That's the next phase of mapping after map mod. Great Lakes is kind of an offshoot of that. But basically, instead of doing countywide mapping, which we've been doing for the last decade, we are now looking at specific watersheds. Primarily at this point, we're working in south central and southeastern Wisconsin. We're using better study data, new topographic data, and also introducing some other non-regulatory products that community officials can use. Whoops. How did that happen? Yes, ma'am.
So I want to clarify, because when one of the questions that we get asked, we issue a floodplain permit for a new house.
Yes.
They build in compliance, and one of the first
So
questions.
they fill it 1 foot above, and the lowest floor is 2 feet above.
2 feet above, right.
If they build in compliance with your ordinance.
Yep, one of the first questions they ask us when we're talking with them, going through the process, is can I then apply for a LOMA? The answer is no.
No.
Yeah,
They'd have to
so-
apply for a LOMAR based on fill.
Right, so
Because
LOMA, yeah.
fill's being added, it's no longer natural grade. So a LOMA is not the proper vehicle. Right. If a surveyor gets an application like that, they should check the box saying fill has been placed on the property, and that application would be kicked back. Now, they might be able to get a LOMAR-F. In that case, they'd have to have an engineer review the fill, and if he's comfortable signing the form, the MT1 form, saying that this property is reasonably safe from flooding, and the community official signs a community acknowledgement form, they could get a LOMAR-F, which also would remove it from the floodplain. But there's a little more engineering work involved, a little more detailed study review. But no, in a case like that, a LOMA should not be applied for because it should be kicked back. And it would be subject to rescission if that one was issued in error.
And the LOMAR fill, based on fill,
Yeah.
that's when the technical bulletin
10-01.
That's when that comes into play.
Right. Now, most of the components of that are where they're filling it and then they're going to put a basement in. If they're just filling it in slab and grade, a lot of that technical stuff doesn't apply. As long as the fill meets the Tech Bulletin 1001 standards as far as homogeneous fill, compaction, and all the rest of it. I mean, you have two options, and I'll talk about that a little bit, Tech Bulletin 1001. They can either meet the simplified approach, which has like 10 different conditions, or if a professional engineer or a soil scientist is willing to sign off that this meets the requirements of Tech Bulletin 1001, either one, along with your community acknowledgement form signature, is what's needed to get that LOMAR based on fill. That make sense, everybody? Okay, all right. Yeah. Okay. There won't be a quiz later, unless you want to take a quiz. I have one handy. Another key thing for fill projects and for LOMARs where you're doing especially a physical alteration, a water course, you have to get statement from the Fish and Wildlife Services, and either Kay or Sue looked into this, and the office is actually right down the road in Green Bay. I guess they cover the whole state, right? Yep. But basically, anytime you replace and fill, you're physically altering a water course. You have to have Fish and Wildlife look at the project site to see if there's any endangered species in that area and what the impact might be on doing this project. So there's several different outcomes. I don't know a lot about this because we've really started just publicizing this issue in the last couple of years because FEMA lost a couple of court cases out in the state of Washington and the state of Oregon, more to do with salmon spawning areas. But basically, the environmental groups that brought the lawsuit said federal regulations, the way they were being administered, were in violation of the Endangered Species Act. And the judge said, you're right, you can't just fill in the floodplain. You have to determine if that's causing a habitat loss or having some other negative impact on an endangered or threatened species. So there's various documents that Fish and Wildlife could issue to an applicant for a project in one of these areas. It could be, there may be some effect, but it's incidental. I can't remember the difference between permit and statement. I don't know if Kay or Sue can remember the difference. Not likely to adversely affect, has no effect, or they can deny it if it's going to have a significant effect. Now, there are consultants out there who can probably tell you more about this whole process. Some of probably the same people that may do some of the wetland identification might have expertise with endangered species. But, you know, there's a fair number of endangered species in Wisconsin. I can't speak to the Door County area, but in southeast Wisconsin we have had horrible problems with a Blanding's turtle and a Garner blue butterfly and a couple other things. And it stopped some fairly major commercial projects in the past. Up here, I can't say what there is along Lake Michigan or the Bay, but this is something that's got to be, you have to have that statement or FEMA will not process that LOMAR-F or LOMAR application anymore. So Procedure Memorandum 64 gives you the basics of it. I would encourage you to look at it if you ever work with field projects or LOMAR projects. So just real quickly, a little bit about responsibilities for various entities involved with making loans for projects in special flood hazard areas. There's been a requirement for 40 years that the lender determine whether a mortgaged property or an applicant for a mortgaged property is in a special flood hazard area. But there's been a lot tightening of the requirements and reporting requirements, and frankly, the federal regulatory entities review requirements. Unlike FEMA, where we have one federal agency that we can turn to for questions about the flood insurance program, floodplain development regulations at the federal level, for how lenders are regulated. There are 6 different federal entities that do that, you know, ranging from the Comptroller of the Currency, Credit Union Administration, Office of Thrift Savings, depending on what type of lending institution it is. So it's a lot more difficult to coordinate with these different entities as far as who's doing a good job of requiring that the Flood Insurance Reform Act regulations are being followed. Flood insurance must be kept in force throughout the life of the loan, or until the loan value drops below $5,000 or the repayment period is less than 1 year. Over those 30 years or 15 years of the loan, lenders have to make sure that coverage is maintained, and if there's any changes in flood zones or flood risk for that property, they must review the policy, review the flood maps, and determine if increases or decreases are warranted to the flood insurance coverage. Most lenders choose not to do that themselves. It's a lot of work, very specialized work. There's high possibility of making errors. So most lenders, what they end up doing is they subcontract that work out to a flood zone determination company. These are the folks. If you have a closing on your house, refi or new origination, whatever it might be, there'll be a fee on there of usually anywhere between $18 and $25 for a flood hazard determination. That goes to one of these companies. Most of them are national companies that determine if a property is in or out of the floodplain. Now the problem we see is there are hundreds, or still maybe thousands. At one time there were thousands of these companies. Most of them were small 1- to 2-person operations. There are about 20 or so large companies, places like GE Capital, Transamerica, that have huge operations. And they belong to an association called the National Flood Determination Association. They have a code of conduct which requires them to not only determine if the parcel of land is in the special flood hazard area, but whether the structure that is being mortgaged and insured, potentially insured, is in the special flood hazard area, because that's the only thing that has to have flood insurance coverage, obviously, are the improvements. Unfortunately, some of the smaller companies don't always go to that length to determine if the house is in or out or the building's in or out. So they may be a small percentage of the number of determinations done every year, maybe 5%, maybe less, but on average every year is at least 20 million flood zone determinations done in this country. So if they're only doing 5%, that's still 1 million determinations. And even if only a small percentage of those 1 million, let's say 10%, are errors, that's still 100,000, where they're calling not the house in, but the parcel in, because that's all their software can do. They can just find out, typically a lot of these companies, they have software that compares parcel layers to flood zone layers. And if there's a hit, where it's 2 layers intersect, they call the structure in. Property owner says, but wait a minute, I'm up on a bluff 20 feet above the lake or the river. There's no way I can be in. But does your property go down to the lake? Well, yes, it does, but I'm 400 feet away. Unfortunately, in some cases, the property owner is going to have to hire a surveyor if they're close. We'll talk about what if they're not close. If there's clearly out, if this flood zone determination company just spent another minute, pulled out the paper map or looked at it online, and saw that, yes, we can see with the aerial photography on the new maps that the structure's here, the flood zone's over here. They're not in the floodplain. That happens all the time. I get lots of calls about that. I'm sure Sue and Kay and Glenn get calls about that all the time. It's unfortunate. We have no control over that. That is something between the lender and the company they work with. Maybe they should think about getting a different flood zone determination company, because it does happen. And you would think it's getting better as technology marches on, but with all the new maps coming along, I get as many calls as ever. And I can tell you for the community officials, typically it's 4 to 6 weeks after the maps go effective. Not the date that they adopt the maps, it's the date on the maps. That's the effective date, because that's when the lenders, the insurance agents, the realtors start using those maps. So that's when, 4 to 6 weeks after that date, they start getting calls from property owners saying, hey, I just got a letter from my lender saying I'm in the floodplain. What the heck? I've never been in the floodplain before. Now they're saying I need to get a flood insurance policy, and I have 45 days, which is a federal requirement, to either purchase my own policy, and if I refuse to do so, the lenders, they have a term for it, they call it forced place, which means they buy a policy on your behalf and put it onto your mortgage payment. And it can be a lot more expensive if it goes that way. If it's automatic placement, it can increase the premium a lot. So we always encourage property owners, just get your policy and then fight the determination, especially if you have a closing coming up, because you can get up to 1 year's worth of premiums refunded if a mistake was made in requiring you to get flood insurance. Someone read the map incorrectly or the map's wrong, and you get a LOMA in that time frame. So get the flood insurance policy, protect yourself, and then if you are vindicated, you'll get the LOMA, and you can get your flood insurance premiums refunded to you. Okay. So where did the LOMAC policies and authority come from? Well, Part 60 of the federal regulations is where we have the floodplain management standards. And the state model floodplain ordinance is a combination of minimum federal standards and higher state standards. We did revise it in recent years, January 2012, because while in most respects we have a higher standard for most things than the federal government does, there were a few cases where we were less restrictive. Some people may have heard of the 100th of a foot standard if you're doing new development in the floodway, like fill in the floodway, and you cause 100th of a foot or more of increase in the base flood elevation, you have to get a map amendment and a rezoning. We have now adopted the zero rise because that's a federal requirement. So we have not changed the state administrative code, but we have changed the state model ordinance, which is required, those minimum standards in the state model, for all communities, all 540 participating communities in Wisconsin. So when you do get new mapping in Door and Kewaunee counties in a couple of years, you will be required to adopt the new state model ordinance. And we'll be working with you at that time to get that done. So again, just to recap, for the MT-EZ and MT1 form, these are the types of LOMACs it can be used for. LOMA is the most common. Conditional letter map amendment, very rare. In fact, I've never seen one of those. Letter map revision based on fill. In some cases, people want to have FEMA review a proposed fill project before they actually do the project. So they apply for a CLOMAR-F, and they get a letter back from FEMA saying, yes, you do meet the standards, and if you do the project as proposed, you will get the LOMAR-F after the project is completed, after the fill project is completed, or you will not. You have to meet additional standards or revise this or that. E-LOMA is just an electronic submittal that can be done by a registered land surveyor or professional engineer. Rather than paper submittals, you can now do electronic submittals to FEMA as part of the LOMA process. Again, to reiterate, a LOMA is a letter from FEMA stating that an existing structure or parcel land has not been elevated by fill and would not be inundated by the base flood. So the most common example is we have bad topographic data, 10-foot USGS quad map data for the community, so there's a margin of error plus or minus 5 feet. The mapping that was done back in 1978 is poor. It shows this bluff in the floodplain. Property owner hires a surveyor to show at the lowest adjacent grade around their structure, where the natural ground hits the foundation of the structure, is actually 6 feet above the BFE. Well, that's a LOMA project. They get the LOMA. That removes the flood insurance purchase requirement. The federal government no longer requires flood insurance. However, let's say they're not 6 feet above. Let's say they're 2 inches above. The lender can say, even though you've gotten a LOMA, because you're so close and because there's a history of flooding in this neighborhood, we're still going to require flood insurance. And that's their prerogative. That's a private business decision the lender can make. Feds aren't requiring it anymore. The lender's saying, okay, we're not going to require $150,000, which is the value of the loan, but because your neighbor 5 years ago, before you moved in, had a foot of water in her basement because you're in a low area and it floods here a lot, we're going to require $25,000 in coverage just to cover ourselves. And they can do that. Your only option as a property owner and applicant is, if you can't talk them out of it, is to look for a different lender, because that is nothing that we have any control or the federal government is in control. Once the LOMA is issued, it's no longer a federal issue or a state issue. It's just between you and the lender. Okay. Hammer to point one more time, based on natural ground without fill. What were the 2 exceptions in natural ground? Anyone remember? Sue? So the fill was placed before the first firm is issued for the community, right? Or the fill was placed at a time when the area was not mapped in the floodplain. So the firm had been issued in 78. In 82, fill was placed in this lot, but at the time it was not in the flood insurance, it was not in the floodplain. 2009, the maps were revised. BFE went up, became part of the floodplain, but because it was placed before 2009, when it was not part of the floodplain, it's considered natural grade. Any other fill at any other time is not natural grade. A LOMA is not allowable for those properties. You must go through the letter map revision fill process. It gets complicated with LOMA-Fs. Typically, as I said a little bit earlier, when you're putting a basement in. Now, if someone's just filling and putting a slab on grade, then it's basically, is the fill properly compacted? Is it 20 feet around the base of the building site, properly graded? Is it homogeneous fill? You know, is it not just a bunch of dirt that was dug up or hauled on site? It has to meet certain standards. If someone wants to put a basement in after the LOMAR-F is granted, they can do that. Remember, sometimes people get the CLOMAR-F to say, I'm going to fill it this way. Does that meet your standards, FEMA? FEMA says, yes, it does. You may go ahead with the fill project, provide the as-built after you put the fill in, and we'll issue the LOMAR-F. Then, only then, can the community issue the building and zoning permits to actually build the structure. After the CLOMAR-F, which is optional, is issued, then the LOMAR-F, which is required. And if someone chooses to put a basement in, then they can. But then there are additional standards for the amount. There has to be a certain amount of fill underneath the floor of the basement. There are conditions for how deep the basement can go into that area. Because even though you filled it, now you're digging a hole back in. It's probably not a good idea. It can be done, but then it kicks in a lot of other standards for a fill project. My recommendation, if someone wants to do such a project, is to work with a registered professional engineer and design a floodproof basement. It'll save a lot of time and hassle down the road, and if you get a floodproofing certificate, it can also save on flood insurance costs. Again, fill in a floodway is not prohibited, but if you do place fill in a floodway, then it's more than a LOMAR F, it's a LOMAR. Because why? Because in the floodway you have moving water, so any fill presents an obstruction of flow. An engineering study would have to be done, what we call an H&H, or hydraulic and hydrologic analysis. And if it causes any increase, anything, any hundredth of a foot, thousandth of a foot, whatever the engineer can determine, it would require a letter of map revision in addition to the LOMAR F. Also, the community must sign the acknowledgement form that the placement of fill meets their standards, the Endangered Species Act requirements are met. To remove it from the floodplain under the local community ordinance and under state requirements, must be filled 2 feet above and contiguous. There must be dryland access. Again, LOMAR Fs may be required by the community. It's not a requirement necessarily, but the LOMAR F must be issued before building and zoning permits can be issued for that project in the filled floodplain area. Difference between MT1 and MTEZ, pretty simple. MTEZ is only for LOMAs, single structure or lot outside the floodway. If it can't meet any of all those standards, then it must go through the MT1 process. Not a great deal of difference. MTEZ is 2 pages, MT1 I think is 4 pages. Some of the information that's required for a LOMA. Pretty straightforward. I know all the surveyors are familiar with all this stuff, as should be the community officials. One of the big hang-ups we see, problems that things get returned, is that the deed is not recorded and stamped and dated. It's got to have all 3 of those things on there. Property information section must be filled out completely. Elevation form or certificate must be filled out and signed and dated. You submit this stuff, FEMA has up to 6 days to review it. And if you were missing something, well, they may wait till day 59 before they get a letter back saying, you forgot to sign this form. So you resubmit it, and now you're in another 60-day period they have to review the resubmitted data, so it can really slow things down. It's kind of like I also equate it with your tax returns. You know, so many just dumb things happen. People forget to sign the returns, they forget to date them, they forget to include their withholding statements, whatever. You know, it's silly little things in many, many cases that cause delays in getting your tax return back. Zone A areas, very critical point. If it is a Zone A, do you have much Zone A in Door County? I'm sure, Glenn, you have quite a bit of Zone A. There's no base flood elevation. There's no floodway, flood fringe. Property owner wants to get removed from the flood insurance requirements. They submit for a LOMA. FEMA asks the property owner or the submitter, the surveyor, whoever it might be, is there any BFE data? Did you check with DNR, DOT, the Corps of Engineers, Regional Planning Commission? Yes, 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 yes. Nothing available. What FEMA does in that case, they do an approximate base flood elevation. Call it a quick 2 analysis, and that's a good term for it because it's like a 20-minute process as opposed to 8, 10, 12 hours to do a proper H&H analysis. And they come up with an approximate BFE that can only be used for determining whether a property is required to pay flood insurance or not. In other words, that approximate BFE does not meet state or local standards for establishing an actual base flood elevation. So it cannot be used for issuing building or zoning permits. To issue a building or zoning permit, we would need an H&H analysis approved by DNR regional engineers before a building and zoning permit could be issued to put a house up. Why? Because we need to know exactly what the BFE is, because it's based on 2 feet above BFE, and we need to know exactly where the floodway line is, because you cannot build in the floodway. So in the past, they used to publish these approximate BFEs on the LOMA determination forms. Property owner coming to the zoning office, waving that, saying, guess what? FEMA gave me a base flood elevation, and unfortunately, more than a few times, the local zoning administrator said, okay, we'll issue the permits based on that, and violation of the local code and state standards, and creates a lot of headaches for us down the road. As I said earlier, when we were talking about flood zone determination companies, some do a great job, some not so good. If they just dropped the ball and didn't really do their due diligence, you may not have to get a survey. You may just be able to get a LOMA out of Showen. It's the same application process as for a standard LOMA. It's just a different outcome. Basically, you submit the MTEZ, the first page of that, just property data information, location, name, address, phone number, all the rest of it. A plat or a parcel map, a registered, a deed, stamped and recorded, aerial photo of the location. You do not need to submit elevations. You do not need to submit a copy of the firm. FEMA has that information available. If the lender won't accept that, what I always tell property owners, applicants when they contact me is, gather this data and talk to the lender and saying, I've seen the firm map, my house is clearly not in, would you reconsider? Some may. You could ask the local zoning official to write a letter on your behalf. Some may accept that, but in many, many cases, and that seems to be the trend, is they're saying, well, it looks good, but I really want something official from FEMA. And that's when you go with the LOMA application, the MTEZ. Property owners can do this themselves. It's not hard. And it's the out of Showen is the outcome. Again, there's no cost for this. And because you don't have to have a survey done, there's literally no cost at all to the property owner. Questions? No? Okay. So basically, just to reiterate, once you submit all your data, FEMA has up to 60 days to review it, determine if it's complete, and issue the LOMA. If not, they can send a request for more information. You then have 90 days to submit that additional data. Make sure you do not exceed that 90-day deadline. Otherwise, especially if it's a LOMAR, you may be required to resubmit, pay another review fee, get stuck with a different reviewer who has to reacquaint themselves with the project and really delay things for you. So these are possible data sources. The problem is that I put this in here, but unless the local community has something, or DOT, through the map mod process, we've mined most of the local sources, the state sources for BFE data for these map modernization projects. So there's not much out there now unless there's been some newer watershed study that a regional planning commission has done or a new bridge has been put in with some benchmark data on it. So there's not a whole lot out there anymore to use, but these are some of the sources you can check. And this is the manual that FEMA uses to come up with those approximate base flood elevations, the quick 2 analysis that I talked about. This document's almost 20 years old, so it's not the latest technology. Cannot be used for issuing zoning or building permits in Wisconsin. There has to be a valid engineering study. Regional engineer, in this case Miles Winkler, would have to review and approve that before that data could be used, that engineering study could be used to issue building and zoning permits. Talked several times about community acknowledgement forms, very important part of the process, and a very key thing for the local zoning administrator to understand their role in this. I've had more than one enforcement case where a LOMAR-F was applied for and there was no supporting documentation, so they rejected LOMAR-F, and we went back to the community and said, well, why'd you sign this form? Well, I was asked to. Well, who asked you to sign it? The mayor. Okay, can we talk to the mayor? Sure. Call up the mayor. Talking to Joe Blow at the zoning office, and he said, you asked him to sign this form? Yeah, that's right. Well, why'd you have him sign it? The developer asked me to. Oh. Did he have any documentation? No, I didn't see anything. Okay. Just a total violation. There was nothing. The developer just needed that form. He needed that form signed, otherwise he couldn't get it. didn't follow the process, and we end up with violations. I have a community in central Wisconsin that's got about 12 properties in the floodplain, all have basements anywhere from 2 to 6 feet below BFE, and they're going to have to fill in their basements. They're all violations, and they have all lost their flood insurance coverage. The community could be put on probation, and it's really unfortunate. But that's why we really stress to the local zoning officials, do not sign that form until you've seen what you need to see. If you have any questions at all, contact Miles or whoever the regional engineer is, or me. Start with Miles. If he can't answer the questions, I'd be happy to help him out. Typically, community acknowledgement form is for low MAR-F or low MAR projects. Either we have fill placed or we have a new study. In this case, for low MARs, where there's a new study, not only is the community official signing the community acknowledgement form, they also are signing the MT2 application on behalf of the applicant. The applicant would have an engineer do the study, but the community, because they're the participating body in the NFIP, they're the ones that actually have to apply for the low MAR, since it's a revision to their adopted effective floodplain information. Just like they might sign a proclamation making, today Founders Day. I mean, they just don't put any more thought into it than that. That's the unfortunate thing about it. This is what you're supposed to check for before you sign the community acknowledgement form. No fill in a floodway. All permits, local, state, and federal, Corps of Engineer permits, DNR wetland permits, whatever it might be, have been issued. Removing the parcel through fill or new study will still ensure it's reasonably safe from flooding, which basically means under the federal program, the base flood elevation will be less than the elevation at the site, or for the state, it's 2 feet above, as we said earlier. Again, just some other common application problems that we mentioned. Got to get that community acknowledgement form taken care of, make sure the deed or plat is recorded. Real briefly, I'll just leave this up for a second. We talked about this already, Tech Bulletin 10-01. This is what they're going to fill in a site and then place a basement. Filled area at least 20 feet from the foundation wall, fills at least 5 feet. There has to be compacted fill at least 5 feet below the basement floor slab. Specific engineering standards for compaction and type of soils. Basement floor no less than 5 feet below BFE. If they can't meet all those standards and an engineer is willing to sign off based on an analysis, they did soil borings, that the structure would be reasonably safe from flooding, that's another option they can pursue. If neither option can be met, they should not sign the form. This community in central Wisconsin, if they had looked at this and had talked to us about it, they never would have signed that form. They wouldn't be in the pickle they're in today. Real briefly, a little bit about ELOMA. I mentioned this earlier for the surveyors or engineers in the crowd. This is a simplified method of submitting for LOMAs. For simple letter of map amendments, single lot out of the floodway or single structure, they can submit electronically and get a fairly quick turnaround. Now, FEMA will still say that we have up to 60 days to review and approve these, but typically if it's an ELOMA submission, I've seen them be turned around in 15, 20 minutes, depending on workload and available staff and all the rest. Again, this is something, you go to the FEMA website or just Google this to find out more about the program. The only thing I will point out is, as a condition of being a user of the ELOMA system, is that you are subject to random audits of your submittals. So if FEMA does a random audit and they find something funky with your elevation data, it might cause you some problems with staying in the system. But it's a great program. I haven't heard any complaints from surveyors to this date. This has been around for, it's going on 2 years now, I think, ELOMA. These are just some of the limitations when it cannot be used. Yes, ma'am?
I think you just answered the question. We get random audits. We didn't know why it was happening.
Okay.
If something specific was triggering it, we just said.
Strictly random. And if that's all you're getting, then you're okay. If you get follow-up questions, then there may be a problem, but it's, yeah, they're just doing these random audits. It's been very, very successful from everyone I've talked to so far. No, the software works fine, the process is working. Have you done a number of these?
Yeah, usually they get a response within an hour.
Yeah, it's very, very impressive turnaround. I mean, FEMA does tens of thousands of LOMAs a year, and you know, they kept thinking that through the map modernization process, they would see a huge reduction in LOMAs, but that hasn't been the case because even though they've remapped 90% of the nation's population, you look in a state like Wisconsin, kind of like with this pre-firm issue with flood insurance, nationwide that may be true that 90% of the nation's population was remapped, but in Wisconsin it's not that high because we have all these rural counties. It may be 80% or 75%, so we have a lot of rural areas where we still have older maps, and it's just more difficult sometimes to process LOMAs. So the E-LOMA is, for a simple LOMA, it's a very big advancement. Now, besides the E-LOMA process, for the average person, property owner, a builder, there is an online process too to apply for a letter of map change. It's not as direct as the E-LOMA process for surveyors and engineers, but they can go do electronic submittal. And this is for all LOMAC types, not just LOMAs. They can do this for LOMARs or LOMAR-Fs. They still have the same 60, 90-day timelines in there, so they're not necessarily guaranteeing it'll be any quicker. But there are some other benefits, as you can see here. I mean, it's easier to save information. Let's say you're a developer, builder, and you're used to doing LOMAs the old-fashioned way, filling out the forms and folding the paperwork, putting an envelope and mailing it in. This way, if you're doing multiples of these every week or every month, you can now save basic information, your address, your name, so on and so on. You get immediate receipt of a case number, which you can then track to see what the progress of your application is going. You can pay fees online with a credit card. You can manage multiple LOMAC applications and see where they're at. You get a lot quicker response if you have questions about your LOMAC application than if you just submitted it by paper. So it's just a simple, electronic interface, and for people who only submit one LOMAC in their life, it probably doesn't make sense, but for professionals who are not surveyors or engineers, might not be a bad idea. The big breakthrough, especially for counties that were modernized but have since gotten LiDAR data also, is that you can now, in some cases, with some restrictions, in place of doing an on-site survey by a registered land surveyor, you can use LiDAR data for issuing LOMAs. Not the LiDAR data itself, but certified contours derived from the LiDAR data. People ask what that means. Basically, FEMA says if a professional surveyor, professional engineer is willing to sign to certify basically that the contours derived from this LiDAR data meet the requirements of Procedure Memorandum 61, FEMA will accept it and process as they would any other LOMA. Kind of like we do for elevation certificates or engineering studies, FEMA's relying on the stamp, the seal, and the signature of that professional submitter as proof that everything was followed, all the regulations were followed, and this LiDAR data, the contour elevations derived from that LiDAR data, are useful and can substitute for an actual on-site site elevation study. So basically that handout we had back there with the diagrams on it, you look at the building footprint on the maps, look at the contour data, you look at the next lowest contour, then they subtract another foot or half of the contour interval from that next lowest contour, and if the base flood elevation is below that number, they will consider the structure out of the floodplain. So it's kind of a conservative approach. It makes sense for that example I gave earlier where someone's on a bluff 20 feet above the body of water, where it's fairly obvious they're out, but the map shows them in, so they can't get a LOMA out as shown. But if LiDAR data is available, and let's say they sit at 900, the first LiDAR contour below that is 898, they subtract a foot from that, 897, and the BFE is 890, they're out. And FEMA will issue the LOMA, removing the flood insurance purchase requirement from that property. So it's following the same format, submitting the MT1 forms, same timelines, everything's pretty much the same. Any questions? I don't know a lot about the LiDAR issue. We have some guidance. FEMA has put out some guidance that we, I think, have on our webpage now, but if you have questions, you can get in touch with me and I can put you in touch with one of our GIS specialists. But basically, if the contour data can be certified, it can be submitted in place of a site survey. Okay, just a few quick slides about conditional letters of map revision and map revision. Nothing really new here. You know, the CLOMAR is, will the proposed project, the study, the physical relocation of the watercourse meet FEMA requirements? And if so, typically the community can go ahead and issue the permit for development, and then when the project's finished, they submit for the LOMAR. The map is not revised until that LOMAR is applied for and received. That's when the annotated map panel comes out. DNR, of course, has to review and approve also in addition to FEMA review, since it is changing the effective base flood elevations or potentially the floodway boundaries or floodplain lines. When is a CLOMAR required? Basically, any time you're encroaching a floodway or causing any increase in the base flood elevation, or you're causing a change in the floodway width plus or minus 20 feet, either decreasing or increasing. Typically, that requires a CLOMAR. Sometimes we have zone AE floodplains where we have a BFE, but we don't have a floodway delineated. In the cases like that, projects can allow increases up to a cumulative of 1 foot for that reach of the river before a CLOMAR is required. So basically, one project is 2/10, another is 5/10. Another person comes in and wants to do 4/10. Well, now you're over a foot total cumulative increase. At that point, that third project, they do have to apply for the CLOMAR because we're getting close to that 1 foot total increase. We don't have a lot of zone AE floodplains and no floodway, but there are some scattered around the state. So they get the CLOMAR because the BFE is going up or the floodway boundaries are changing by more than 20 feet. They do the project, they submit for the LOMAR. As I said, it does not change the effective firm panel. They just get an additional annotated firm panel, which also must be adopted by the community zoning officials into their ordinance. So panel 177 is still effective, but now you have panel 177A, which revises that one discrete section of the stream, that 1/2 mile or mile. So it's just an additional regulatory product that the community adopts into their ordinance, and it requires DNR review and approval, as we would do for any other ordinance adoption or revision to the floodplain ordinance. So to recap, LOMARs are always required for any change in the BFE, increase or decrease. The key difference is if it's a decrease in BFE, a CLOMAR is not required, but after the project is complete, a LOMAR is required. If it's an increase, you have to get the CLOMAR first, then the LOMAR. If there's a change in the floodway boundaries, then you have to get the LOMAR after the study is done. Typically in this state, it's mostly floodway issues, coastal high hazard areas. It does come up occasionally. We don't see a lot of development in the floodplains and the high hazard areas, but sometimes we do. One of the things that they're talking about with the Great Lakes project is we might have some coastal V zones, which will have a whole new set of regulations that we've never dealt with in Wisconsin before. It would change the type of construction that's allowed. I don't want to say too much about it because it's very preliminary. It's more of a policy decision, I guess, because we don't allow new structures on fill, but in a coastal V zone, you cannot place fill. You must elevate on pilings of some sort. So,
I think we just said that backwards.
What did I say?
Right now, we don't allow new structures on pilings.
Right, I'm sorry. Yeah.
But the V zone may
Require pilings, yes, that's correct. Yep. Yeah. So we'll see. Stay tuned for that. Like I said, that's still a couple of years out. Typical examples when a LOMAR is needed, just some examples, new analyses, upgraded hydrology. Some of these are fee exempt. If better data is being provided, new studies, new topographic data, things like that, fees typically aren't charged for a LOMAR. LOMAR fees are typically charged when you're doing development. That's changing base flood elevations. You're putting a structure, you're placing fill, you're doing stream relocation, something like that. But if you're helping provide data that's going to update the maps, typically it does not require a fee being paid to the federal government. I don't know if I mentioned this, but the minimum review fee for a Lomar is $5,000. Sir?
Did I understand you saying that the firms that were issued for Door County are being redone?
Along the coastline.
Right.
There's a new study of the Great Lakes. So the coastline firms, those panels, in a couple of years will be reissued based on these new flood elevations. Whether they go up or down, doesn't matter. They will have to reissue those firm panels.
The ones that you distributed at the Neville Museum, and they were mailed out on CDs, are those not correct? Is that what you're saying?
When was that done, sir?
Well, there was a floodplain meeting at the Neville Museum last year down in Green Bay. You've also mailed out some CDs, or FEMA's mailed out CDs with floodplain mapping.
Well, last year,
Those were prior to the transect data and the transect, he's talking about all the transect.
transect data and all that? Okay.
In preparation
That's part
for
of
the
this, of the
study.
new study.
Yeah.
What?
The stuff that you got last year is part of the new study. So the maps we have now are from 2009, but we're getting new ones, we're not sure when.
Probably 2015. So, yeah, those maps were just of the transect, proposed transect locations, that is what you probably are thinking of. So we had maps of the coastline with the lines drawn on showing where we thought the best place for transects, and we were asking communities to tell us, do we need more transects, less transects, move transect lines? So that was not a regulatory product. That was just for your feedback to us.
Okay, so
Yeah.
there's no new maps at this point?
No, nothing new. Sometime, what I've been told, probably sometime in 2015. The best guess we have now is a preliminary firm panels for the coastline, in Door and Kewanee, Brown, all the rest. And I get confused about this. You know, it may be that you'll have to double check, I'll have to double check. Miles would know. It may be that the 4 southern counties are going to get them first, I think, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, it's, Sheboygan on south, I think those preliminaries are going to be next September. This September? Maybe it is, and then you guys will be in September 2014. That could be. So I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly, but it's at least a year out for you folks before you get the preliminary maps. And it's a much slower process than Riverine. Well, it'll take longer to review the appeals process and then for making any revisions if we get any. So it'll probably be sometime in 2015 before those maps go effective. So a couple years probably, at this best guess at this point. And some of the application materials, community concurrence has to sign off on that along with the acknowledgement form. State approval for new studies, work maps. We don't see a lot of LOMARs in the state, typically anywhere between 10 and 30 a year, mostly in the densely populated corridors, southeast Wisconsin, the Fox River Valley, where land values are so high and the pace of development is so great that developers see the value of spending $10,000 to $20,000 on a study and another $5,000 to $10,000 on a review fee to squeeze another 3, 4, 5 acres of land out of a proposed building site. In rural areas, you almost never see a LOMAR. You almost never see a LOMAR for a single-family house. Typically, it's shopping centers, medical clinics, highway projects in some cases, things like that. Real briefly, just a couple slides about the requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations 6512. Just want to point out that the first bullet point here, yes, that is required for a LOMAR, where the project will increase BFE, but not only is there the property owner notification, but the state has a standard that you must also procure flooding easements from any affected property owners. In any case, any property owner is going to see higher flood elevations on their property due to your project. The community must not only notify those property owners that elevations are going up, but they must ensure as part of the application process, as part of our review and approval process, that legal easements have been granted, flooding easements from those property owners. Very difficult to get that. So it's been quite difficult over the years to get LOMARs where properties outside of the applicant property are being affected. No structures can be impacted, insurable structures. You have alternatives evaluation similar to the wetlands program. Why are you doing it this way? If you're causing an impact, can you redesign the project so you cause no impact or lesser impact? And of course, endangered species compliance as always. To recap, the community of zoning official must sign the MT2 forms. Make sure that the fill placed on site meets Tech Bulletin 1001. And if it's a multi-community project, every community must sign off. The individual legal notices to the affected property owners. It can either be published in a local paper or they can be sent separately. Most communities just send the notices separately to the community, to the residents that are affected by it. Important point here is the appeal period for LOMARs. It used to be there was just an appeal period when BFEs were being revised. Now it's any change to the effective floodplain data. So whether it's a BFE increase or decrease, floodway boundary, floodplain boundary, pretty much any LOMAR that's affecting a local datum, it's being changed. An appeal period, typically a 3-month appeal period, is required. And just some of the common problems you see in LOMAR submittals. A lot of the same stuff as with LOMA submittals, sometimes real basic stuff, names, addresses, dates, warranted, registered deeds, they're not stamped or recorded properly. Confusion about if fees are required or not. As I said, a lot of projects that provide better data and improve the maps don't require a fee. But just because you're providing new data in support of a development project doesn't mean it's fee exempt. Typically a fee is still required. So here's the 4 major categories for fee exempt projects. Correcting bad data on existing maps, updated data, natural changes. You have the floodplain or the river channel changing because of accretion of materials on one side or loss of materials on the other, and certain levee and other flood control projects that are mostly federally funded. So to recap on the MT2 concurrence forms, who must sign it? The property owner, the applicant. Number 1, community floodplain administrator, zoning official, village clerk, whoever. Number 2, and the professional engineer who did the study. Number 3, and the FEMA requirements, property owner notifications, certification of no insurable structures are impacted, and alternatives evaluation. Keep in mind that if BFEs are going up, flooding easements must be obtained from any affected property owners as part of the process. We cannot review and approve the H&H analysis until we have those flooding easements in hand. Again, the turnaround times, little different for LOMARs. It's 90 days instead of 60 days. If there's data missing or incorrect data, typically the submitter will get an additional 90 days once notified of the problems. So it's a long process. 6 to 12 months is typical. I've seen them take a couple years with back and forth between the engineers and the reviewers. Again, just keep in mind you have 90 days to submit the requested data if something was missing. Especially for LOMARs, folks, if you don't get in within 90 days, start all over again on a new application, pay another review fee, and you may get a different reviewer, which is going to slow down the process even more. Kind of cover some of these same numbers. That first phone number is very important for questions about the LOMA process, or just general questions about mapping. 1877 FEMA MAP, which is the MAP Service Center. Very professional folks, not long wait times. I've never been kept on hold longer than a minute or so. And most of the questions I've asked, I've got an answer from the first level. Very rarely have I had to been able to bump me up to another level person to talk to, so they've been pretty good to work with. I wouldn't bother writing this stuff down. It's easier just to Google these terms, MTEZ, MT1, or MT2, to get these forms. You can also get tutorials on how to fill these out online. There's also other documentation out there that is very helpful. And as I said, FEMA also has a number of technical bulletins, which you can just Google technical bulletin. There's about 12 of them. Floodproof basements, wet floodproofing, elevators, all kinds of things out there. Crawl spaces. Not all of it's applicable in Wisconsin, but some of it is very helpful here. Again, FEMA's gone paperless on many things. We don't even get a copy of new firm panels. So in 2015, when you get new coastal panels here for Door County, Kewaunee County, you will get a copy, the counties, the cities, and villages. We had to print out our own. You can always order more, but you have to pay for it through the Map Service Center. You can also print them if you have a large format printer. Or if you don't at your city or village, the county may have something and may be able to provide it for a reasonable cost to you. But yeah, they don't keep huge warehouses full of paper products like they used to. So when you get those new maps, protect them as best you can. Finally, last year the address for sending letters of map change has changed. If you're doing it electronically, of course, you don't have to worry about this, but this is a new address. It would be on the current documentation on the website, but just as more of a reminder to you folks that we have a new address. And with that, that is all of the formal presentation. Anything I did? Yes, sir.
I guess I have a question for Mariah. When you've shown the floodplain mapping, floodplain boundaries on the county GIS map, and someone does a site survey and turns it in for a zoning permit, do you verify that the floodplain boundaries shown on your map match the actual surveyor information? Do you correct and verify your data on your website?
The maps are basically a guideline. The surveyed elevations are the exact determinations, and that's what we need to have in order to determine if the project is in or out. And then our permits are based on surveyed elevations. Those are based on LiDAR data, which are only 2-foot contours, and the accuracy is not good enough to issue a permit off of. So as far as that's the permitting process, removal, Gary just went through the removal.
We don't have authority to change the boundary on our
Right.
GIS.
Right, we can only remove it from a physical map through the process Gary was talking about, and then through a subsequent county removal map process.
Do you do that at all?
We haven't had any go through a formal removal process, no.
With the letter, but we do have letters of map amendment.
Amendments, yes.
That we keep.
There is some confusion out there about zoning administrator's authority to make calls in or out for a proposed project. So you have old maps, poor topo data, and there's clearly an error on the map, and a property is clearly above the base flood elevation. The zoning authority can interpret the map to say, you are out of the floodplain, we will issue a zoning building permit to build there. However, our best advice is only issue that permit on a condition that the property owners apply for a LOMA to formalize it, because FEMA is very concerned, even if you follow all the right steps in your ordinance, they're not told about it. Unless you apply for a LOMA, they will not know that this property has been determined to be out of the floodplain until that LOMA is submitted. So since the LOMA is free to them, they've already paid for the survey to prove that their base flood elevation, their site is above probably. They should apply for a LOMA to formalize that process. Otherwise, if a community assistance visit is done, they might call it a violation. Plus, if they don't get the LOMA, even though you've called it out and said you can build there and we'll issue the permits, it's still in for flood insurance purposes. So when in doubt, get the LOMA. Yes, Glenn?
How long does it take for an H&H analysis to be done in the case plan?
How long to do the analysis? Depends. I mean, it's so site specific. I would say for a simple project, a single lot where you're just restudying a given point on a stream, so maybe you're just restudying a stretch of river between two bridges and they're half-mile apart. I mean, that typically can probably be done in a couple weeks. It's paid for by the applicant, and the cost for something like that, I would say the minimum is probably going to be $5,000 or $6,000. It could be as much as 10 to 15, depending on the age of the study. What?
So it probably won't ever be done, because the applicant's not going to pay that kind of money.
No. It's like I said, typically that's going to be for large commercial projects. or for highway projects where they're putting new bridges or they're filling in the floodway, something like that. We almost never see it for single-family development where they're doing. Our department used to do case-by-case analysis, but we just don't have the staff anymore to do it. So, yeah, in Zone A areas, it's tough. They can wait to see if the area is modernized at some point, but in rural areas, unless it's clearly out, clearly a high spot, then it's inadvertently mapped in, inadvertently included, and they get the survey, it's unlikely. Yes?
I just wanted to point out something. You were talking about basements in the floodplain.
Yes.
I know Brown County has a basement exemption, and they allow for basements in the floodplain, but I don't believe Kiwanee or Door does.
No,
So
we do not.
I know you were speaking generally, but with regard to Kiwanee and
The
Door.
only communities that have a basement exemption are Brown County, the city of Green Bay, Alloway, Swamico, and might be one other one up there. That's pretty much it. And then I think Shiocton down in Outagamie County has it. Yeah, no one in Door or Kewaunee County has a basement exemption. Even if they have a basement exemption, they're still limited on how deep that basement can be. Typically 3 feet below the base flood elevation, or if it's contiguous lands outside the floodplain, it could be up to 5 feet below. But there's another set of costs then. You have to have an engineered plan, you have to reinforce walls, and you still spend thousands and thousands of dollars to do it in addition to normal construction costs. So it's still not a simple option. It's not necessarily that much cheaper than doing a study to show you're out of the floodplain. Nowadays, it's almost impossible to get a basement exemption. Basically, you have to have very low velocity, very low flood depths. You have to have more than 12 hours warning time of a flood. There's a number of things. So it's not an easy thing to get. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Jerry, you mentioned a rule change regarding filling the floodplain and not exceeding the 100th of a foot now being no.
Well, it's not a rule change to say FEMA's always had a zero rise standard. It's just that Wisconsin, in our administrative code, used to have, well, we still do in NR 116, 100th of a foot rise, but that's in violation of the federal rules, so we have to comport with the minimum federal standards. We can't be less restrictive than the feds, so we've just changed our ordinance to comply with the federal requirements. So we have not changed our rules. It's just that after all these years, the feds have finally said, you guys are out of compliance, we're going to make you comply, is basically what happened. So it was a change of the model ordinance.
Is that just for floodway?
Well, that's really where it applies. Essentially, in the flood fringe, the way we model floodplains, when they do the modeling, they assume there's no flood storage available there and there's no conveyance there. So typically, you can fill in a flood fringe without having to do a study, period. So it's only in a floodway where you're placing fill, or let's say you're putting a bridge in, you're putting an abutment in. You have to do a study. If that causes any rise, then you have to do a LOMAR and go through the alternatives analysis and all the rest of it. Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone coming. You've been a great audience. Good questions. Made me think a few times. I get to stretch the gray matter up here. And I want to thank Sue and Kay and Mariah and the rest of the staff for inviting. Well, they kind of ordered me up here. They said I have to come to Door County. So, but anyways, ladies, thank you very much. I appreciated it. And have a good day, everybody.
A copy of your PowerPoint to put on our website so people can.
Yeah, were you able to?
I wasn't able to do it with our.
It will be posted. It will be posted to our website probably next week or the week after.